I knew the moment I saw Karren Billings marching up my driveway, clipboard in hand, that my day was about to take a nosedive. She had that tight-lipped, self-important expression she always wore when she was about to make someone's life miserable. I leaned against my pickup, arms crossed, waiting for whatever nonsense she had cooked up this time. Karren, the self-appointed dictator of the neighborhood HOA, had been on a power trip for months. I had watched her harass my neighbors over everything from the color of their flower pots to the height of their grass. But up until now, she hadn't come for me. I figured my job alone made her hesitate. Most people got nervous around law enforcement. But today, she looked downright gleeful. "Xander Vaughn," she began, her voice dripping with fake politeness. "I'm here on official HOA business." I sighed. "What is it now, Karren?" She flipped through the papers on her clipboard. "Your vehicle is in violation of HOA regulations. Unauthorized decals." I frowned, glancing at my truck. The only decals on it were my police department insignia and a small American flag. "You mean my department badge?" She gave me a tight smile. "Yes, that. It's not approved under HOA guidelines." I nearly laughed. "Karren, that's my official work vehicle. I'm a police captain. That decal is non-negotiable." She clucked her tongue. "Rules are rules, Xander. If we let one person slide, we'll have chaos. I'm afraid you'll need to remove it or there will be consequences." I crossed my arms, leveling her with a stare. "Not happening." Her expression darkened. "Fine. You'll leave me no choice." I didn't think much of it at the time. Just another empty threat from a woman who loved to throw her weight around. But the next morning, my truck was gone. At first, I thought it had been stolen. I stood in my driveway, staring at the empty space where my pickup had been parked, running through possible scenarios in my head. Then I spotted the bright orange notice taped to my garage door. "Towed for HOA violation." I clenched my jaw. So that's how she wanted to play it. I grabbed my keys and headed straight to the impound lot listed on the notice. The guy behind the counter barely looked at me as he flipped through a clipboard. "Yeah, HOA had it towed. Gonna be a $300 release fee," he said, chewing on a toothpick. I pulled out my badge and set it on the counter. "You're holding a police vehicle. I suggest you waive that fee and release it immediately before this turns into a legal nightmare for your company." The guy's eyes widened. "Oh, let me get my manager." 5 minutes later, my truck was back in my possession, but I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Karren had overstepped, and now it was time to remind her exactly who she was messing with. Driving my truck back into the neighborhood, I kept my grip tight on the wheel, my mind already working through the next steps. Karren had made a serious mistake. She hadn't just inconvenienced me, she had unlawfully removed a government-marked vehicle. That wasn't some minor HOA infraction. That was an illegal tow, and I was going to make sure she felt every legal consequence of that choice. I pulled into my driveway and shut off the engine, stepping out just as a few neighbors peeked from their windows. Word traveled fast around here, and I had no doubt Karren had already spread her version of events. That was fine. I had no interest in playing her game. I was about to end it. I walked straight into my house, grabbed my laptop, and pulled up every HOA regulation I could find. I wanted to know exactly what she had cited to justify the tow. It didn't take long to find the section on vehicle restrictions, and just as I expected, there was no rule barring official law enforcement insignia. She had fabricated the violation. That was all the proof I needed. After making a few calls, I drove down to the county clerk's office to file an official complaint. HOA boards had authority, sure, but they weren't above the law. And they certainly didn't have the power to unlawfully seize a legally registered vehicle, especially not one belonging to law enforcement. I outlined every violation Karren had committed, attaching the impound notice as evidence. With everything submitted, I made one more stop before heading home, the police department. I wasn't the type to use my position for personal matters, but this wasn't about personal grievances anymore. Karren had crossed a legal line, and I had every right to escalate it. By the time I got back to the neighborhood, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows over the neatly manicured lawns. I parked in my driveway and took a deep breath. It was time for the next step. I walked straight to Karren's house. Lights glowed through the front windows and I could hear the faint sound of a television inside. I knocked, firm and deliberate. It didn't take long for her to answer. She opened the door with that same smug expression, clipboard still in hand as if she had been waiting for me to show up. Before she could speak, I handed her a copy of the formal complaint I had just filed. She glanced at it, her eyes skimming over the words, and for the first time, I saw her confidence falter. She looked back up at me, her expression tight. I didn't give her the chance to recover. I laid out every single violation she had committed, my tone calm but firm. She had no legal authority to tow my truck. She had fabricated a non-existent rule. And now she was facing an official investigation. Her face paled slightly and she opened her mouth, but I continued. I informed her that the police department was now involved and that she would need to provide documentation justifying her actions. Documentation that didn't exist because she had made everything up. For the first time since I had known her, Karren was speechless. I didn't wait for a response. I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving her standing in her doorway, gripping that useless clipboard like it could save her. By the next morning, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. News spread fast, and it wasn't long before several other residents came forward with similar complaints: unjust fines, arbitrary rule enforcement, even threats of property liens. People had been too afraid to fight back before, but now that someone had called her out, they were ready to speak up. I spent the next few days gathering statements from neighbors, encouraging them to document every interaction they had with the HOA. The more evidence we had, the stronger our case would be. And then the real hammer dropped. A formal review of the HOA's practices was launched at the county level. Officials began combing through records, and what they found wasn't just troubling, it was damning. Misuse of HOA funds, unauthorized citations, and even fraudulent bookkeeping. Karren had spent years building her little empire of control, but now it was crumbling beneath her. The final blow came when she was removed from her position. The HOA board, desperate to save face, voted her out in an emergency meeting. And just like that, the reign of terror was over. As I stood on my porch, watching her pack boxes into her car, I felt a deep satisfaction settle in. Justice had been served. With Karren stripped of her HOA power, the neighborhood took a collective breath of relief. The oppressive atmosphere she had created was dissipating, and for the first time in years, people felt like they had control over their own homes again. But her removal didn't mean the mess she left behind had disappeared. The HOA was still under investigation, and there were plenty of financial discrepancies that needed to be addressed. Misallocated funds, fabricated fines, and unexplained expenses had piled up over the years, and now that she was no longer in charge, the remaining board members were scrambling to distance themselves from the fallout. They made a show of holding emergency meetings, promising reforms, but I wasn't convinced. Most of them had stood by Karren's side the whole time, backing her decisions without question. Now that she was gone, they were pretending they had nothing to do with it. I wasn't about to let them get away with it. I met with several neighbors who had suffered under Karren's rule. Some had been issued bogus fines, others had been threatened with legal action if they didn't comply with ridiculous regulations. One family had even been forced to repaint their entire house because Karren claimed the shade of blue they used wasn't in harmony with the community's aesthetic. The more stories I heard, the clearer it became that Karren hadn't been working alone. At least 2 other board members had been directly involved in enforcing her fabricated rules. They had signed off on the fines, approved the towing, and even funneled HOA funds into unnecessary projects that just so happened to benefit them personally. Armed with this information, I filed an official complaint with the county's HOA Oversight Committee. Unlike the local HOA board, this was a governing body with real legal authority. Once I laid out the evidence, they launched a full-scale audit of the HOA's financial records, pulling years' worth of documents and transactions. What they found wasn't just negligence, it was outright fraud. Thousands of dollars had been misappropriated. Funds meant for neighborhood maintenance had been used for personal expenses, including meals at high-end restaurants, spa treatments, and even travel. The worst part? Karren and her allies had been billing the community for administrative costs while pocketing the money. The audit report was damning. When it was presented at the next HOA meeting, the remaining board members had no choice but to resign. The entire room erupted in anger as homeowners realized just how much they had been manipulated. People demanded answers, and for the first time, the board had none to give. A special election was scheduled to replace them, and for the first time in years, the community was going to have leadership that actually worked for the people, not against them. But there was still one last piece of unfinished business. With the fraudulent activity exposed, Karren wasn't just looking at social disgrace, she was looking at criminal charges. The county prosecutor opened an investigation, and within weeks, she was facing legal consequences for her actions. Misuse of HOA funds, falsification of documents, and unauthorized enforcement of non-existent rules were just the beginning. The day she was officially charged, the neighborhood gathered outside to watch as she packed the last of her belongings into her car. Gone was the smug arrogance she had once carried. Now, she moved with quiet desperation, avoiding eye contact, knowing that everyone who had once feared her was now reveling in her downfall. As she climbed into her car, she hesitated, glancing in my direction. For a moment, it looked like she wanted to say something, but whatever it was, she swallowed it down and drove off without a word. With her gone, the neighborhood finally had a chance to heal. The new HOA board focused on transparency, implementing policies that ensured no one could abuse their power like Karren had. The fabricated fines were rescinded and homeowners who had been wrongfully penalized were reimbursed. For the first time in years, the community felt like a neighborhood again, not a dictatorship. And as I stood on my porch watching kids ride their bikes freely down the street, I knew we had one. With Karren out of the picture and the old HOA board dismantled, the neighborhood had started to reclaim its sense of normalcy. The tension that had once hung over every interaction was gone. People who had barely spoken during her reign of control were now gathering in their driveways, chatting like old friends. Kids played freely in the cul-de-sacs without parents worrying about some ridiculous HOA ordinance being thrown at them. It was a relief to see the community come back to life. But Karren's departure didn't mean everything was fixed. The damage she'd done was deeper than just the fraudulent fines and misused funds. She had left the HOA's finances in complete disarray, and the new board was scrambling to piece everything together. I had been asked to sit in on one of the meetings as an advisor, given my involvement in exposing the corruption. I wasn't interested in an official position, but I agreed to help where I could. When I arrived at the meeting, it was clear that the new board was overwhelmed. The treasurer, a retired accountant named Martha, was sifting through a mountain of receipts, invoices, and half-filled ledgers. The rest of the board looked equally frustrated. They had inherited an absolute mess. Records were incomplete, some payments had no documentation, and entire financial statements were missing. Martha looked up, shaking her head. She explained that Karren had been running the HOA like her personal kingdom, and no one had ever questioned her. With her gone, they were finding just how deep the mismanagement went. I listened carefully as they laid out the situation. The HOA was supposed to have a reserve fund for emergency repairs, but it was almost empty. Monthly dues had been collected, but a significant portion of the money had been funneled into administrative expenses that didn't add up. Vendors who had supposedly been paid for community maintenance had no record of receiving checks. It was clear that Karren's corruption hadn't just been about control, it had been about lining her own pockets. I advised them to bring in a forensic accountant to go through everything. They needed a professional to track where the money had gone and determine if there were grounds for further legal action. The board agreed, and within a week, an expert had been hired to untangle the financial chaos. As the investigation unfolded, more troubling details emerged. Karren hadn't just been pocketing HOA funds, she had also been using her position to bully and manipulate homeowners into giving her money under the guise of special assessments. Some residents had been forced to pay hundreds, even thousands, in supposed fees for repairs that had never been completed. Several elderly homeowners had been particularly targeted. Karren had convinced them they owed back payments and pressured them into handing over cash to settle their accounts. When I heard that, my patience snapped. It was one thing to abuse her power, but preying on the elderly? That was outright criminal. Armed with the evidence from the forensic accountant, I made another call to the county prosecutor's office. The case against Karren was growing stronger by the day. The fraudulent tow of my truck had been the tip of the iceberg now. She was facing serious charges, including embezzlement and financial fraud. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was rallying together like never before. The new board, determined to make things right, had started holding open meetings where residents could voice their concerns. People who had once been too afraid to speak up were now coming forward with their own stories of how Karren had manipulated them. One homeowner, a single mother named Lisa, shared how Karren had threatened to put a lien on her house if she didn't pay a fabricated fine for excessive noise. Another resident, an elderly veteran, revealed that he had been forced to repaint his home twice because Karren kept rejecting the colors he chose despite them being on the approved list. The more stories that surfaced, the clearer it became that Karren's reign of control had been built on intimidation and deceit. The final blow came when the county prosecutor officially filed charges against her. The news spread fast, and the neighborhood erupted in celebration. For years, Karren had acted like she was untouchable, but now, she was finally being held accountable. As her trial date approached, I received a call from one of my contacts at the department. Karren had tried to negotiate a deal, claiming she had been misunderstood and that everything had been a clerical mistake. The prosecutor wasn't buying it. The evidence against her was airtight, and she was looking at serious legal consequences. On the day of her arraignment, a few neighbors gathered outside the courthouse, watching as she walked in, flanked by her lawyer. Gone was the carefully curated image of control. She looked nervous, avoiding eye contact with anyone she passed. The hearing was short, but the charges were serious. She was officially indicted for fraud, embezzlement, and unlawful enforcement of HOA regulations. Her bail was set high, and she was ordered to surrender her passport. Back in the neighborhood, the transformation was remarkable. With Karren gone and the new board in place, people were finally free to enjoy their homes without fear of arbitrary fines or retaliatory enforcement. The security cameras people had installed to protect themselves from the HOA's harassment were now being used to capture moments of community gatherings and celebrations. The new board implemented a system of checks and balances to ensure that no one person could ever wield the kind of unchecked power Karren had abused. Financial transparency became a priority, with monthly reports available for all homeowners to review. And as for me, I had no interest in getting involved with HOA politics any further, but I was more than happy to see the neighborhood thrive. I had moved here for peace and quiet, and now I was finally getting it. One evening, as I sat on my porch, a few neighbors stopped by, chatting about how much things had changed. They thanked me for standing up to Karren, for exposing her corruption and helping to restore the community. I shrugged it off. It had never been about recognition. It had been about doing what was right. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the peaceful streets, I leaned back in my chair, finally able to enjoy the neighborhood I had fought to protect. With Karren out of the picture and the HOA under honest leadership, the neighborhood settled into a sense of normalcy that hadn't existed in years. The paranoia that once hung in the air had been replaced with relief. People no longer peered out their windows in fear of some new violation notice. The oppressive rule Karren had wielded was gone, and the neighborhood was finally able to function like an actual community. But while the surface looked calm, the fallout from her corruption was still rippling through the HOA's finances. The forensic accountant's final report had been even more damning than expected. It turned out that Karren hadn't acted alone. Two of her former board allies had been siphoning money along with her, though they had been more careful about covering their tracks. The prosecutor's office wasted no time in expanding the investigation. The two board members in question had resigned in disgrace after Karren's removal, thinking they had escaped scrutiny. But now they were facing their own set of legal troubles. Bank records showed that they had approved fraudulent contractor payments, money that had been funneled into shell accounts. They had also been receiving kickbacks from a landscaping company they had personally selected without board approval. The community was furious. They had already been reeling from Karren's financial abuse, but realizing that even more of their hard-earned dues had been stolen pushed them over the edge. The new board, determined to earn the trust of the homeowners, filed a civil lawsuit on behalf of the HOA, seeking to recover the missing funds. As the legal battle played out, the neighborhood was undergoing a transformation. The old, rigid HOA rules were being rewritten to prevent another power-hungry tyrant from taking over. Homeowners were given direct voting rights on all major financial decisions, and a new oversight committee was established to ensure transparency. Despite all the progress, there was still unfinished business. The fraudulent fines Karren had imposed were being reversed, but some homeowners had already paid them under duress. Those people needed to be reimbursed, and with the HOA's finances still recovering, the board had to get creative. A few homeowners suggested a community fundraiser to help those who had been forced to pay illegitimate fines. What started as a simple idea quickly turned into a full-scale neighborhood event. People donated time, baked goods, and even services to raise money. A local barbecue restaurant contributed a massive catering spread, and a silent auction featured everything from handyman services to weekend getaways donated by generous residents. The turnout was overwhelming. Families who had never participated in HOA meetings showed up in droves. Laughter and conversation filled the air, a stark contrast to the tension that had once defined every gathering under Karren's rule. People were no longer afraid of their neighbors, they were reconnecting after years of forced isolation under oppressive HOA policies. By the end of the night, they had raised more than enough to reimburse every homeowner who had been unfairly fined. The remaining funds were put into a new emergency reserve, ensuring the HOA would never again be left vulnerable to financial mismanagement. While the neighborhood was moving forward, Karren's situation was worsening. Her trial date was approaching, and the evidence against her was overwhelming. The stolen funds, the falsified records, the coercion tactics, she had left a paper trail that was impossible to deny. She had no leverage, no way to spin her actions as anything other than blatant theft and abuse of power. Her lawyer had tried to negotiate a plea deal, offering partial restitution in exchange for a reduced sentence, but the prosecutor wasn't interested in leniency. The community wanted justice, and they were going to get it. When the trial finally began, several homeowners testified against her. One by one, they recounted the ways she had manipulated, threatened, and stolen from them. Some spoke about the sleepless nights spent worrying over unjust fines. Others described the financial strain she had caused with her fabricated fees. Each testimony painted a clear picture of a woman who had wielded power like a weapon, caring more about control than the well-being of the community. The jury didn't take long to deliberate. When the verdict was read, the courtroom was silent except for Karren's sharp intake of breath. Guilty, on every count. She was sentenced to serve time, along with a hefty restitution order that would ensure she spent years paying back what she had stolen. The two former board members who had participated in the financial fraud also faced penalties, though their sentences were lighter. With her gone for good, the final chapter of her reign of terror had officially closed. In the months that followed, the neighborhood continued to thrive. The new HOA board proved themselves to be fair and transparent, and the oversight committee ensured that no single person would ever again have unchecked power. People who had once avoided HOA meetings now participated eagerly, making sure their voices were heard. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset, a few neighbors stopped by. They talked about how much things had changed, how the neighborhood finally felt like home again. For the first time in years, there was no fear, no intimidation, no absurd citations or sudden fines, just peace. And it was about time. With Karren behind bars and the corrupt former board members exposed, the neighborhood had finally started to rebuild itself from the mess she left behind. The HOA, now under the leadership of honest and competent individuals, was making good on its promise to restore trust. Homeowners were no longer tiptoeing around in fear of receiving frivolous fines, and the atmosphere had shifted entirely. But while the community had found peace, I wasn't quite ready to close the book on everything just yet. There was still unfinished business that needed to be addressed, and I intended to see it through. One lingering issue was the fraudulent liens Karren had placed on several properties. While the HOA had managed to reimburse homeowners for illegitimate fines, some residents were still dealing with the legal mess she had left in her wake. A handful of families had been threatened with foreclosure over bogus violations, and while those threats had been rendered void, the paperwork was still tangled in bureaucratic red tape. The new HOA board had been working hard to help those affected, but the process was slow. I decided to step in, using my connections at the county level to expedite the removal of any fraudulent claims Karren had filed. It took weeks of back and forth, but eventually every last lien was erased. The homeowners who had been living under the constant stress of losing their houses were finally free from the last remnants of her corruption. With that taken care of, I turned my attention to another pressing matter, ensuring that no future HOA leadership could ever abuse their power the way Karren had. While the new board was trustworthy, there was no guarantee that future members wouldn't try to follow in her footsteps. I worked with the county's Homeowner Protection Division to draft new regulations that would limit the authority of HOA boards across the region. The reforms introduced mandatory oversight for financial transactions, required independent audits of HOA funds, and restricted the ability of board members to issue fines without clear, documented proof of violations. These measures ensured that no board member could ever fabricate rules the way Karren had. The proposal faced pushback from a few remaining HOA loyalists who still clung to the old regime, but they were vastly outnumbered. Homeowners had learned their lesson, and they weren't about to let history repeat itself. The reforms were passed with overwhelming support, setting a precedent for other communities dealing with similar abuses. By the time everything was finalized, life in the neighborhood had settled into a comfortable rhythm. The HOA was functioning as it should, enforcing only reasonable regulations that benefited everyone rather than serving as a tool for power-hungry individuals. One evening, as I was working on my truck in the driveway, a group of neighbors stopped by. They had been organizing a community appreciation event to celebrate the changes that had taken place, and they wanted me to attend. I wasn't one for public recognition, but they insisted. When the day of the event arrived, I was surprised by how much effort had gone into it. The once tense neighborhood was now filled with laughter and conversation, with people mingling freely in a way they never had before. As I walked through the gathering, homeowners approached me to express their gratitude, each one sharing how much their lives had improved since Karren's downfall. Some had been able to renovate their homes without fear of arbitrary rejections, while others finally felt comfortable using their own driveways without worrying about fabricated violations. At one point, the new HOA president took the stage and addressed the crowd. She spoke about the importance of community and how the neighborhood had transformed from a place of fear into one of cooperation. She thanked everyone who had played a role in making that happen, and while I wasn't one for speeches, I appreciated the sentiment. As the sun set and the event wrapped up, I took a moment to reflect on everything that had happened. It had been a long battle, but in the end, justice had prevailed. The neighborhood was free from corruption, the homeowners had taken back control, and the system had been changed to prevent future abuse. For the first time since moving in, I felt like I could finally enjoy my home without having to fight for it. And that, more than anything, was the real victory.